Western capitalism in particular is the only culture that has embraced the acceptance of people.
Yeah, right.
Like transgender people, people who are gay, people who are marginalized. I mean, Western capitalist society is one of the very few cultures that openly abhors racism.
Right, right, right. Well, and these people are anti-capitalist on their iPhones. Right, you don't get to do that. Right, it's a performative contradiction.
That's so important.
Yeah, they're on their iPhones while they're flying.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's
While
like,
they're
I'm
flying.
anti-capitalist. It's like, well, actually, no, you're not. You're just deeply confused.
My favorite little example of this, if you forgive me, is this guy. How many of you have got this guy in your pocket? Lovely, isn't it? It is kind of brilliant, right? And even when you take it out of the dumbass case that I've got, because I drop things all the time, it looks great, right? So Steve Jobs is a genius. How many of the technology, there's 6 critical technologies in this thing. How many of them did Steve invent? 0. Can you do you know any of them, sir? You seem to know this story. Touchscreens, exactly. Who invented touchscreens? United States Air Force, taxpayer dollars. It's called Lodestar. TCP/IP, DARPA, secure communications in the event of a nuclear attack, backbone of the internet. What else have we got? GPS, United States Navy, global positioning satellites. You seeing a pattern here? You paid for all this stuff. Where's your equity share? You didn't get it. We just gave it to the private sector. Because entrepreneurs are so awesome. Yeah, when they put it in a shiny box and we all go gaga. But there is definitely value in this, because if you left it to a bunch of geeks in Bell Labs, they would never have thought of this. I mean, that's the honest truth, right? You actually need these people to turn it into commercial products. That's how capitalism works. We were doing this in the 19th century. But here's the difference. Where is this made? And about 12 other countries. Now here's the interesting thing about the global supply chain that makes this possible, from the touch screen to the chips to the plastic to everything. You can go on a website and calculate how much of this component is probably made by slave labor. Right? Disturbing but true, because even Apple, who actually are a good company despite their tax dodging bullshit, they're really actually trying to clean out their supply chains, work with reputable factories. They're not into exploiting the workers. That's not their gig. But they can switch production from one Indonesian manufacturer to a Taiwanese manufacturer overnight and get the specs online in 3 days. What do you think the margins of those companies are? So what do you think the profits of Apple are? How much of the profitability of this resides in China at the end of the day? 6 cents in the dollar. This is what Donald's upset about. 40 cents still goes to Cupertino, right off bat. Now, where do they put their taxes? And they pay an effective rate of 0.02%. In the 1970s, corporates used to pay 20% of taxes. Today, they pay 2%. Who's filling in the gap? Or we're dealing with budgetary austerity, because no one has the balls to call them on it. Now, that's what's changed. You go back to David Ricardo for a minute. You've still got the competition. You have the competitiveness. You have capitalists squeezing labor. But labor was able to resist. Starting in the 1980s, they were no longer able to resist. And at first, we thought it was just those industrial workers. They were bad jobs anyway. We didn't care about that. It's fine. It's good that those people aren't doing that. What are they doing instead? They're working in Walmart. Knock yourself out. Then we got call centers, but you can't move services, can you? And so they started going from Indiana to India. And then after that, well, you know, they can't do that to my kids. My kids have a college education. Hold on to your seats. Of course you can do that. Now, at the end of the day, the reason we do this is not because of the inevitability of something called globalization. It's because of a massive failure of public policy and a massive failure of spine by the people who are meant to represent those people, who don't, who represent Apple in Cupertino instead. Now that brings us all the way back to Shaw. Because remember the play. Who's the guy who stumps up for the lease on the brothel in Brussels? A member of the industrial and aristocratic elite. As they say where I grew up, same shit, different smell.
It's so ironic when someone is talking about how capitalism sucks on an iPhone.
Mind that capitalism is a bit of a myth. We don't really have capitalist societies. We have state capitalist societies. And the state has always played an essential, central role in development and extension of the capitalist system. So that goes back to England in the 17th century and all the way through the history of development. But let's just take the recent period. So take today's high-tech economy. Now take, say, your iPhone. If you take your iPhone and you take the technology in it and take it apart, turns out that almost everything comes from the state sector. The GPS was developed by the Navy, the electronics was developed in military labs, everything. The computer that's in front of you. The computers began to be developed in the 1950s, actually in large part in the lab where I happened to be working. It wasn't until 1977 that Apple was able to produce a computer that could be marketed for profit. That's after about 30 years of research and development in the state sector. Now, suppose we had capitalist societies. One of the principles of capitalism is supposed to be that if you invest in something, especially if you invest to make a risky, costly investment over, say, 30 years, and there's some profit that comes out, it's supposed to go back to you. But our system doesn't work like that. It goes to Bill Gates and Jeff Bezos. The public pays the costs through various devices, university labs and so on. And then after many years, something is handed over to private corporations and they make the profit. Same with the internet. The beginnings of the internet were in the late 1950s, actually in the same lab where I was working at MIT. That began thinking about the internet. And it developed over decades within the government system, meaning taxpayer support. Finally, around 1995, the public made a gift, simply a gift to private corporations to say, okay, you guys can have the internet that we developed. Now we have the half a dozen huge mega corporations which run the internet. It's a public gift, most of you have, say, iPhones or something like that in your pocket. Take a look at them. For example, they have in them a GPS. Where'd the GPS come from? It was created by the U.S. Navy, the Navistar program. It has microelectronics, software, hardware, almost all created for decades, mostly in the state sector, under often in the U.S. Pentagon funding, here the counterpart. Taxpayers pay for this because they think they're protecting their security. That's what they're told. But in fact, the government doesn't care about your security. What it cares is about its own power and security for corporate power. And the way the system works is the taxpayer takes the risks, carries out the investment for decades, literally decades. Finally, something may come out which is profitable, and then the profit goes to the private sector. If we had anything remotely like capitalist systems, we don't, they would adhere to the capitalist principle that if an investor takes risks and invests and waits and takes risky steps, and if something comes out of it, the profit goes back to the investor. That's not the way it works here. The profit goes to people who had nothing to do with it. The risks are taken by you, often through the Pentagon and comparable systems, and if anything comes out, the profits go to Microsoft and Apple. Now, they didn't create it. They take it. It's given to them. And it literally is decades. So computers were the computer market, personal computer market, became viable in 1977, I think it was. Apple was the first. That was about 30 years after the development of computers, almost all in the state sector, like in the building where I work. And it's if you buy pharmaceuticals, let's say, the research, the basic research and development is pretty much done in the state sector. Places like probably the biology lab right here probably gets government funding, grants. And that's all across the board. when you look back at these, I mentioned the Trans-Pacific Partnership. One part of that was leaked by WikiLeaks. It's secret except for the corporate lawyers and lobbyists, but one part was leaked. It was the part on intellectual property. Intellectual property is a polite term, a kind of a euphemism for government-instituted monopoly pricing rights. That's what it really means. It means extraordinarily high patent rights, which have never existed in history, for the pharmaceutical corporations and some other corporations. That's to keep the price of drugs up and make profits astronomical. Now there's a pretext. The pharmaceutical corporations say, look, we need that for research and development. Well, that's been investigated. Turns out that probably at least half of the R&D is not done by the pharmaceutical corporations at all. It's done by the state sector and so on. And that's an underestimate, because if you take a close look, the part that's done by the pharmaceutical corporations is towards the marketing end, like, you know, flip around a molecule to get a new drug. But the basic research, the hard, costly, risky research, that's done by people like you. You pay for it through your taxes. And the pharmaceutical corporations rip off the profit. Actually, there is a study one study by a very good American economist, Dean Baker, who estimated what would happen if R&D was 100% funded by the public and the pharmaceutical corporations were compelled to go on the market to sell what they produce. It turns out there'd be a colossal saving for the public, and of course a sharp reduction in profits of the big industries. That's intellectual property. That's the part of the Trans-Pacific Partnership that